Hi, welcome to another episode of Table 13, set up by me, a wooden leg, and the rest of the Irrational Radio crew. Today, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. Instead of a Q&A, I'm going to be doing something that I've done in the past, which is to give a lecture over something that I find important within either philosophy, storytelling, or role-playing to share with you guys. And this isn't this is my opinion. It's not concrete fact, and you should take it as such. Today, we're going to be talking about relationships and the relationships that show up within role-playing campaigns. There are several types of these relationships that I would like to go over today. The first kind is the most common that we talk about, which is the DM to the role players. This relationship can be categorized as a top-down relationship in that the DM usually has more authority and control than the role players. In this kind of relationship, can be categorized as a parent to child or a teacher to students, though that perspective can be problematic, and I will talk about that in a little bit. The next relationship that I would like to discuss is the relationship of the role players to each other. This relationship can be where the most common problems can arise within campaigns, in that if you have people that disagree on how to roleplay, on what their character's motivations should be, or on just the actions taken within each session. And these can cause people of strife by either in-character strife, as in you have a roguish character that is constantly stealing and disrupting from the party, or you can have out-of-character conflict, where two role players are either within a relationship outside the game or have some kind of beef with one another that bleeds into the role-playing game. There are some strategies that you can take as a role player and as a DM to foster good relationships between your role players, and I will discuss those as well at length. The next relationship is the reverse of the DM to the role players, and that is the role players to the DM. This is important to categorize differently because as a role player, you have a different sort of expectation towards the DM than the DM has towards the role players. This is for the role players that would like to get something out of these videos as well, and how to be a good role player and how to foster a good relationship between you and your DM. The last two types of relationships that I would like to go over are the DM to the story and the role players to the story. Now, it seems a little bit strange to give story a facet as any other real person, but it is a conglomeration of all the actors and all the people that are making the story happen, which is the DM and the role players. Both parties are involved, and so it has facets of both people, and thus isn't in the control of either one group or the other, and as such each group has a certain relationship to the story that I would like to discuss. You can have good relationships with story and bad relationships with story, and we'll discuss those as well. So we'll get right into it here. The first relationship I would like to discuss is the most common and the most discussed. It is the DM to the role players. This, like I said, can be categorized as a top-down relationship. The DM technically does have more control over the game and the story, but it is not supposed to be antagonistic towards the role players. A teacher's job is not to win against the students, nor is it a parent's job to beat their children at things. So it is their job to grow and make the environments that these children or the students can grow in, rather than be antagonistic towards them. As DM, therefore, you must play alongside your role players, and when I say that, I mean you must be part of their triumphs, share their triumphs, be disappointed when things don't turn out like they want to, and generally be on their team in terms of out of character motivation. Say things like, "Man, I hope you guys get there," and or "I hope this thing happens." You must divorce yourself as the DM from the control that you could have over the story. You are, for lack of a better term, the vehicle that the people are using to explore this story's topography. And you don't get to decide where to go, but you have to take the role players. You have to take the role players wherever they would like to go. And in that means that you have to work well with both them and internally with yourself and the plans that you've made for them, the scenes that you have decided on. Long-term watchers of this show will know that I don't necessarily plan sessions in the classic scene-by-scene type. Rather, I build my sessions through reaction to the role players. What they do, I try to store in my brain and then put back at them. And in this way, I'm not necessarily creating all the antagonistic opportunities for them in a way that I hope will defeat them. Rather, I am just trying to act as reasonably as possible as a world. If you are causing issue and getting into people's way, there will be a greater reaction than if you hide in an inn for days and days and days. Someone who hides themselves does not cause as much of a scene as someone who doesn't. And there's many, many, many more types of facets. Now, I'll probably make another lecture over how to react to role players in believable ways and how to modulate a universe in a believable way. But that's a little bit off topic here. Moving back, I like to think that I am discovering the story rather than laying it down and letting the role players move through it. I am moving through it with the role players. I cannot tell you what will happen 3 sessions from the session that we've just done in a role-playing campaign. Usually, I can't even tell you what will happen at the end of the session that we have just done in a role-playing or what will happen at the end of the session that we have just started in a role-playing campaign. Most of the time, I just have the NPCs and the laws of the world that I know exist, and then I see what the role players do, and then move those pieces in accordance with the rules that I have set and the motivations that I have given my NPCs. In so that the story falls out from the role players' actions, rather than me having to hammer one out from the granite of a solid block of story. A solid block of setting, I should say. A setting is much like a solid piece or a raw material, like clay, in that it has great purpose, and with enough care you can make many, many things with it. But there are different ways of using this clay and molding this clay. If you want to have complete control over what it turns out to be, don't roleplay. Write a book or write a play. Don't expect your plans to work out in any way, shape, or form like you have planned right now. Always expect the unexpected, and in fact, build your toolbox as a DM in order to always be in the unexpected. React rather than plan. And in this way, you will be able to sit with the role players on their side of the table and bite your fingernails along with them. Oh, will they be able to convince this count to betray his mistress? Will they be able to convince the king that the goblin army is just miles down the road? As the DM, I don't know. It depends on what they do and how the king reacts. Now, I do control the king as the DM. I know that I can just say, oh, yep, sure, I'll do that, or nope, not at all, and just sit on my hands. But that isn't fair to the role players. You must act as the king. You must have motivations that the king would have. You're worried about your position. You're worried about your treasury. You're worried about all these things. And therefore, it's going to make you maybe not want to side with the role players. Maybe you kind of want to side, but there's a few things in the way. Another thing I see DMs do a lot is in the relationship category, rather than try to build with the role players, just feel like it's their job to put roadblocks in front of the role players and what they're trying to do. I also disagree with that DMing strategy. You are a vehicle for the role players to attempt to do what they want to do, and therefore you need to give them tools in order for them to try and succeed. And there must be a chance of success in whatever they do. Unless it's an emergency, you must not force them down a path. This is the aforementioned railroading that many people hate and loathe to see in a DM, and this is why, is that the DM has a carefully constructed plan, and the role players have upset it, and the DM then decides on things. Never do that. Always keep everything up in the air. Just react to the role players. And in this way, the relationship that you have with the role players will become one of almost role player to role player. You get to talk to them like you are a role player. Oh, I wonder what's in that cave. Oh, I wonder what will happen to that noble that we saved. And you get to have a much more you get to be on their level rather than up in the DM clouds. And I think that that is much more useful to a DM than believing that they are a parent guiding their children through some kind of petting zoo, and is a problematic relationship perspective. So I suggest that you look at the relationship more as camaraderie and playing alongside your role players. It'll also make it much more fun for you because then you get to discover things alongside of them. And I will go on. I will talk about discovery at a later date, and what I mean by that, because there's a quote by one of my favorite authors, Stephen King, about archaeology and writing. And he says that he does not actually ever write a story. He discovers stories. He may find a toe bone in the way that the supermarket has been acting today, and then slowly uncover the rest of the story by logically moving from one point to the next, by building characters from small ideas, following the grain of what the character is moving towards. And in this way, you don't necessarily control the story you control the story in the same way. I'll leave it to metaphor, one of my favorite ways of talking. You control your car, but it doesn't mean that as soon as you get into the car, you're going to drive it off the road. The roads have been set there in order to make driving for you much easier. And in the same way, as the DM, you want to treat the story like a car in the road. You control the car, but no normal person is going to choose to drive their car into a ditch unless they're trying some insurance scam. And as a DM, it's your job to keep this car on the road and to move through the obstacles that would be put there by the path the role players have chosen to take and find ways around it that they may be able to discover. The metaphor is getting pretty deep and entrenched here, so we'll just pop out. And so I'll leave you with the archaeology metaphor. As a DM, try to discover your story like an archaeologist discovers a skeleton. Don't try to be a sculptor and build a skeleton. Discover it with your role players. So next, I'm going to talk about role players to role players and the relationships that we find in between the people that are part of the role-playing campaign that we're putting on. Now, role players are much bigger of a group than a DM. A DM is only one person, unless you have the rare co-DMing, which I may do an entire talk on co-DMing. I recently have started co-DMing a setting with one of my friends, and it's going very well, but there have been challenges that surprised me sometimes. So I will talk about co-DMing at another time, but for now, we will say that all sessions consist of one DM and a handful of role players, whether that be 2 to 5 or even the rare 8 role-playing games. But in this way, the more people you have, the more relationships that are created. I believe that it increases on a squared scale in that every time you add a new role player, it adds the same number of relationships as the number of people within the session already. So you can imagine how many more relationships are in a group of 5 than in a group of 2. And in this way, we're all humans, and we all get annoyed with people, and sometimes we find our fellow role players are doing something annoying or something that isn't necessarily how we believed that the campaign would go about. And as such, a lot of problems can happen. In fact, I think that more problems happen in games between role players than they do DM to role player. And this is just, of course, my opinion and my perspective, so it may be different for some of you. But in my perspective, I have found that most of the problems consist of when role players have different expectations of other role players, or different expectations of other people's characters, or even different expectations of what a role-playing campaign really is and really means. I know some role players who treat role-playing campaigns as a cathartic experience, in that they role-play in order to act out, in order to do things they couldn't do within the real world. And then I know some role players who role-play for character, as in they want to role-play as a character and pretend that they are this character with all the limitations that being that kind of character would come about with. And those two types of role players, while they can work together, it can lead to some problems because the one that wants to act out and wants to just do things that they couldn't get away with in the real world is generally going to come into contact with or generally going to come into like conflict with the role player who wants to role play a character. And generally, what I have found along my own campaigns and along some of the memes and tropes that I've found in my 10 years of playing this game is that many of the characters that want to act out, that want to experience things they couldn't do in the real world, generally play chaotic or evil characters. In that, not to say that at the center everyone wants to be evil, but no one who wants to be able to do things they couldn't do in the real world will just trade their restrictions in the real world for another set of restrictions. And that's not breaking free. That's just being bound in a different way. Where, in chaos, and, I generally dislike the alignment system in D&D, but it's handy for times like this. In chaos and in chaotic characters, they're generally not bound by things. That's kind of the point of chaos. They're generally not restricted into a single line of reasoning or a single line of action, whereas lawful characters are. So I generally find many of the people that want to play as a character and pretend that they are such and so, really seriously, they tend to play lawful characters. And in this way, if you have lawful and chaotic characters in the same party, while I say it can work out sometimes, it has problems. There are problems that come along with that, as I'm sure many of you know. And in that, the lawful and chaotic characters end up killing each other in some way. And in this we kind of want to fix this by making sure that we understand as role players the expectations of the other role players, and the expectation that the DM has to the role players as well. In this relationship, I would like to introduce what I call the spirit of the game, and it is the general spirit of what is going on in the role-playing campaign. And I'm sure you've heard like spirit of the job or there is a better way to put it, but like when you start a new job and they say, well, this is how things are done around here, what they're talking about is like the spirit of the workplace, how people are expected to react to other people, or how people are expected to act as a general average, I suppose. As a DM and as a role player, it is very important that you find the spirit of the game within any games that you take part in, or even spirit of the sessions, but that's getting a little bit ahead of myself. In spirit of the game, you kind of want to determine what are the role players here trying to get out of this game. Is this a cathartic game? Is this a game where a bunch of people are just acting out and trying to make each other laugh as hard as possible? Or is this a game that everyone is trying to actually bring about some kind of emotional connection to either the characters or the other people in the game? Neither one is a technical right answer, because it's not, there is no right answer in art. But if you get in deep and try to understand what kind of facet these role players are working on as a DM or as a role player joining a party, you will have more ability to find your place in this group of people than if you attempt to just ignore what the other people expect and just run the game or run your character how you want to do it. A lot of successful sessions and successful campaigns are give and take between the DM and the role players. And in that, following along that, you must, as a role player, give sometimes. If you're a person that kind of wants to act out and steal everything in sight, try to have some restraint. Maybe even try to come up with ways where the restraint from killing things or restraint from stealing from people is bringing about some interesting character change, or bringing about some interesting conflict among you and maybe an NPC or something, rather than just doing it. And if you're a lawful character, Maybe if you see evil or see chaos, don't jump down the throat of the NPC or the character that did it. Try to be a little bit more complicated than that. Your motivations as characters don't necessarily have to be black and white. They are one sentence descriptions that describe what your character wants out of life, yes, but there are many times where we have a goal in life that we want, but we choose something that maybe doesn't help us reach our goal, or choose something that maybe seems against what we have just said that we believe in. And in this way, you become more rounded as a person, more rounded as a character as well. If you allow yourself as a character moments of weakness or moments of uncertainty towards the thing that you want in life, you become more interesting and you give other role players the ability to play off of you a little bit. Now, that's all well and good, but what about the outside conflicts? The conflicts between, two role players that may be dating, or two friends who just got into a large argument? How do you repair the bonds between people outside of the game, especially as a DM? I've heard horror stories of entire games, really good games, being destroyed because two people couldn't get along anymore, and they were two very important parts of the campaign. And so you want to avoid that. You want to try to, as the DM, if you see two role players that are having some friction between them, some conflict, communication is always what I preach, and I will say it until I'm blue to the face. Communicate with both of them. Don't force any kind of conclusion. If you love the game enough, and if you believe that they love the game enough, there will be some kind of compromise or some kind of resolution. If there's not, then you either have to choose to keep the game or not. But always communicate first. Always try to gather as much information about the conflict as possible before you make decisions. Unless a snap decision is necessarily to be made within, and I've talked about some of the things that require emergency decisions, like, sexual assault in games, or people being racist or antagonistic to, a very disrupted degree in games where you're just like, you have to go. But in that kind of way, it's much more easier to determine what you do. If you have two people that are having a conflict and it's way outside the game, like let's say Steve and John are arguing because Steve stole John's Xbox, 2 days ago, but you have a session tomorrow, and Steve and John are just arguing. You're fighting, and Steve asks you to kick John out of the game because he stole the device. What do? Well, always get information. Don't make a snap decision and kick him out. Don't try to pretend everything is going to be okay. Talk to them. Not only talk to them, but talk to the other role players. Make sure everyone is on the same page before you decide to move forward with a decision. If this means postponing sessions, do it. If it means maybe even canceling a game because you can't actually find some kind of common ground between two people, do it, but do it amicably. Don't create more conflict where there is already conflict. And this goes for if you are the role player that has a problem with another role player. Communication is the thing that solves 90% of these kind of problems. Reach out to the person you have a problem with. Explain to them what the problem is. And for the love of God, use neutral language. Do not use accusatory language. Do not say you always or all the time or when you do this. Try to only restrict yourself to your own emotions. Because putting words in someone's mouth just gives them a ledge on which to argue against you. By just reporting on your own feelings, the stance of, oh, you don't actually feel like that, or gaslighting is not a very strong one. And, if you're a DM or if you're a role player with a problem, try to avoid, something like that. But that is why communication is always super important, is that sometimes in those kind of situations you can find, the commonality or the common problem through just communication, especially if you use that neutral language. Because then maybe they can come back and tell you how they feel. And another thing that I want to go through in terms of relationships is that just because you approach someone with a calm head and then you give them a nice little message and then they return with ire or with, an explosive attitude, it doesn't suddenly give you the right to return that. Patience and the virtues that go along with that aren't a tradable system. It's not one for one. You don't just give patience when you get patience. That's not a good way of living a life, and it's not a good way of running a campaign or being a character within a campaign. Rather, if you really want to be on the right side of things, be the one that always ends their sentence with periods. Be the one that always uses neutral language. Say, I feel, or this is the thing that is upsetting me, or those kind of language, those kind of words, reporting words rather than accusatory words. Accusatory words always inflame between when you have conflicts between people. Never try to put words in someone's mouth that you're having a disagreement with. There's never ever been a time that I've either seen a disagreement or been part of a disagreement where someone is like, you're always doing this or you're always doing that, and that person's like, oh, you're right, I am always doing that. Why, I will just have to stop doing that then. Especially if you say something like that and overblow it. Oh, you kill every NPC we come across. Well, that's not obviously true. And also along with the accusatory language, don't use absolutes. Don't say all the time. Just every, never, don't use those words because you're always going to be wrong. Unless in very small situations where you're not going to be wrong in those using those absolute words, but most of the time you will. Continuing. So something you can do to help the story along as a role player to another role player is try to play off of their characters. Try to find the things the characters like. Try to find reactions that are funny or entertaining. Try to find, meaning between your characters and try to play off each other rather than, the old, oh, I want to get the most kills or I want to get the most kills. Try to do collaborative work as role players rather than competing against one another and I know I try, this is my opinion, but I tend not to enjoy the games very much where it's just let's see who can make the other people laugh. And while campaigns like that are perfectly fine if everyone's on board, I find you get more depth if you really take time and get into the role player or get into the campaign. And even more so, I think that it's going to be more rewarding for both types of role players to really put an effort into getting to know the other role players' characters and trying to forge some kind of relationship between them. Look for ways to get your character to join the party. Look for ways to get your character involved in the party. And don't just try to find ways to stop those things from happening. I've seen a lot of edgy characters just not want to communicate with the party or not want to communicate with their DM because, it's what my character would do. Well, that may be, but the point of the game isn't just to play what a character would do. And even so, just like the DM has complete control over the game, you as a role player have control over your character. I know that some, and this is kind of an interesting thing, is that while you have complete control of your character, at the one point, it does not excuse you throwing up your hands and saying, well, Grub the orc would kill this innkeeper because Grub hates everybody. It's what the character would do. It's just like, oh, okay. That's great, but it's gonna derail and it's going to ruin the plans of the rest of your party. Don't try not to be that role player. Instead, try to find ways to make what your character would do enhance the party. Try to find ways of doing what your role player would do to make the plans of the party turn out better. And then if you do get into your character quite a bit, you can earn the ability to say it's what my character would do and then make a mistake on purpose. But if you do it all the time, you have wasted the narrative potential of making a mistake on purpose because it's what your character would do. I don't technically like the ire that has been geared towards the excuse of it's what my character would do, but I tend to agree when people use it as an excuse to disrupt the campaign versus when people use it as an excuse to deepen the story. And there is a very big difference between disrupting the campaign and deepening a narrative. That's probably another talk altogether. So, going along those lines is that where you're trying to play off of another person, the relationship between the role players and the DM is also a very important one, and it's the reverse of the DM to role players. As a role playing character, you should not look or try to trip up your DM. You should not try to fool them. You should not try to, incite panic in them or ruin their plans. It is not a versus game. You are not trying to beat the DM. You are not trying to figure out what the DM hasn't thought of yet. That kind of adversarial role playing is never going to lead anywhere but a giggle fest or see who can laugh the hardest. If you're really interested in running or being part of a campaign that really has depth, try to work with the dungeon master. Sometimes dungeon masters rely on tropes. If a shadowy man in the corner is at a bar and the DM has gone to pains to describe him, find a reason for your role player to go talk to him. Don't just see all the hooks the DM has laid out for you as landmines that you must avoid to really do what your character would want to do. Allow your DM to tell you a story. And they may be a story that takes part in a single session, or it might be a story that takes part over a long period. But allow your DM to tell a story. It doesn't have to be the story that they necessarily have planned on, but try to work with your DM. Don't try to fuss them up. In fact, it's much more fun as a role player to fuss up your DM on accident, because you're playing the game in that way. You're actually playing the game rather than some kind of adversarial war game that I see a lot of campaigns sometimes turn into. You want to work with your dungeon master towards the spirit of the game, like I said. Determine what your DM kind of wants to happen in this story and do your best to try to make that happen for them. They would like to be, have fun or see neat stuff as much as you do. And in fact, sometimes as a DM, it's even more rewarding because you get to see this whole flower, this whole story bloom in front of you in a way that you could have never written by yourself. And that's the magic of role-playing. And so along with that, try to respect the systems that the DM has built. And they can be something as complex as like an entire king's court, or just how the local guard runs their shifts. If the DM says that the guards come in at 8 o'clock in the morning and then guard the town and then leave at 8 o'clock at night, that's the system. It might not make sense. It might not be even very realistic, but don't challenge it based on an out of game sense. Don't stop the game and being like, oh, well then what? No, I just gonna come in at night then. Or why would they do that? Don't challenge the DM. Sometimes the DM has a plan. Maybe that they're leaving that open for you as characters to explore. Explore it as a character rather than as a role player snarking at the DM. Most of most of the advice that I give role players comes from me being a DM more than being a role player. So if some of these things sound a little bit biased towards the DM, that would be why, because I am definitely a DM first and a role player far, far, far second. So most of the times when I'm giving this advice, I'm saying like, as a DM, these are the things I've seen role players do that as a role player you shouldn't do because it made me pull my hair out. But that's my opinion, and maybe your DM likes to get befuzzled. Maybe he wants the challenge to try to determine what the character is going to do next. And if that's the case, then that's the spirit of the game. But if it's not the case, and maybe the DM's getting frustrated, try to work with them. Try to drop them a bone. You have control of your character like they control the world. So, Along with that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the relationship that the DM has to the story and the role players have to the story. Story is very interesting in the role-playing sense in that it is something that is created by not one person, but by a community effort, by a large group of people. In this way, it's different from a lot of other storytelling mediums, in fact, most storytelling mediums, because there's always usually a singular person that is telling the story, in that there is usually a singular person or a small group of people that is deciding how the story will go, and then they give it to another group of people who then put the story on. This can be mostly seen in plays or movies, in that you might have a large group of writers, but none of the writers necessarily are going to be acting in the thing, nor are any of the writers going to be main characters, unless it's some kind of artsy think piece. In this way, role-playing is unique. You have a large group of people, well, not large, but a group of 6 to 10 people, 5 to 10 people, that are all taking part within a narrative that is being created by all of the people that are taking part in the narrative, that are listening to it. In, podcasted games or games that are put online for other people to watch serially are a little different, but most of the time, sessions are an extremely intimate thing. They're just a story that a group of 6 people are telling each other. They're a small circle building a story based on, well, then I'm going to do this. What are you going to do? Well, then I'm going to do this. Ooh, that's interesting. As a DM, it is your job to foster that relationship, to grow that story. Something, what I would like, a metaphor that I would like to fall back on is, as a parent, it is not your job to control how the child turns out. Actually, this is a poor metaphor. Better metaphor. A gardener. As a gardener, it is not your job to form the plants into the appropriate form that the plants will take. It's your job to nurture the environment that the plant is in so that the plant can grow itself. The gardener doesn't grow the plant grows the plant. The gardener creates the ecosystem and creates the environment in which the plant is able to grow. A story, and along the lines, a fantastic campaign, is much like a plant. It is not grown by any singular person. It is grown by itself and the parts that make up itself. And the people that are around it, the DM most specifically, is tasked with making sure that that plant flourishes, blooms into something really special that the DM and the role players can then share together for many years to come. The campaign maybe only last a year, but if it's powerful enough and you have created a story together with these people, you'll be talking about it for decades down the road. It'll be as if you all were there doing the thing. You will remember it as such. And in that respect, it's very important as the DM not to make decisions that cut the game off at the roots, that salt the land. Sometimes that requires you giving up a lot of the power as a DM that the DM may be able to wield. Sometimes that requires, not railroading the characters. You can kill a story. There's nothing greater than railroading a story if you want to kill it. Or a campaign. That's a very quick way to kill a game. But it's your job as a DM to avoid those things and to grow this story into something very special. Don't confuse the story with yourself. In that just because you're the DM of some very successful campaign or some campaign that everyone is really loving, don't confuse your decisions with the story. In that, you're not the one who made it. The role players might go, oh, this is a great campaign. Thank you for running it. You're doing such a good job. You're such a good DM. Don't let that go to your head. Don't think, oh, well, then I'm going to do this. Don't do that. Keep on reacting to the story and keep on fostering it. Don't suddenly get into your head that the plant would look better with only one branch, or maybe the plant would look better in another part of the garden. Just leave it alone and let it grow. If it's having trouble, if there are parts that may be stopping the plant from growing, then take action. But don't ever take action and don't ever change something because you're getting a big head. As a DM, you want to make sure that you are tending the story first and then having fun, or and then, exploring your setting, or telling that neat twist that you wanted to say. And instead, you're trying to create an environment where both role players and yourself can create something greater than all of you. That's really the magic. Going along with that, the role players also have the same kind of responsibility, but in a different way. As the role players, I see you as kind of the insects or the other living things that create the ecosystem in which the plant can thrive. A plant cannot thrive with just a gardener and dirt. It also needs an ecosystem surrounding it, and I think that the role players create that. And as role players, you also want to foster an environment where this thing, this story, this plant can grow. You want to make decisions that lead to something rather than negative decisions or decisions and to not do things. Nothing kills a campaign faster than inaction as a role player, or action that has no sense, or action that is just for action's sake. As a character, you want to try to build a story. You don't want to, well, you ought to try to build a story. Don't try to, win or something. There is no winning here. You win when you look back 2 years down the road at a campaign that's been going 1 week, every week sessions, 300 sessions, and you feel like you're part of another family. That is winning. And with that, that is the end of my lecture. If you have any questions or would like to talk to me directly, we have a Discord community called Rational Radio that you're more than welcome to join if you're not a part of already. There's a channel in there called Table 13, and I'm always available for questions and comments and concerns. Again, I would like to stress these are my opinions. They're not facts or anything, just experiences that I've had that have led me to some of these conclusions. I'd like to share it with you guys because I think that I'd really like to help grow art. So thank you very much for tuning in, and I will see you next. Actually, sorry, there won't be a table third. No, there will be. Yeah. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you next week. Goodbye.